Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. This is an analysis to gain an understanding of Guy de Maupassant's short story, Two Friends. This short story by Guy de Maupassant is only 2,200 words, but the third-person narrator paints a picture, one of the most powerful pictures of war, friendship, freedom, in my opinion, that it was ever written. Here's what happened. Paris was under siege because the Prussians are at war with the French. Messieurs Morissot and Sauvage, two friends before the war, they meet and they decide to go fishing as they did every week before the war. They obtain a pass, they go fishing, and then they're captured by the Prussians. The Prussian commander tells them that he will let them go if they give him the password that they got them through the French lines, or he will shoot them. Two friends keep silent, and they are shot. The Prussians throw the bodies in the river, and then the commander orders the cook to fry up the fish that they caught. Pretty simple, but it is very, very complex, as we're going to show you. Let's start with the narrator. Whenever we analyze stories, we always look for the first part, the first sentence, the first paragraph, the first page to determine the narrator of the story, which is very, very important. There's only two kinds of narrators, first and third. And as always, it's important to understand the narrator's position in any story. And why is that? Well, in this one, the narrator is outside the story, not inside, so he's designated the third-person narrator. Why is that important? Well, the third-person narrator is the godlike narrator, the omniscient narrator, and you have to believe him if you're going to understand the story. If this were a first-person, and we've read first-person and third-person narrator stories before with Jimmy, if he was a first-person narrator, it would be a very, very different story. So, for example, if you read the story with Jimmy, if one of the two friends was the narrator of this story, it really wouldn't work because they both die at the end. And the commander, the Prussian commander, couldn't be the narrator because he doesn't know the extent of the friendship of the two friends. So this is a third-person narrator telling this, which means we have to believe what he says in order for the story to make sense. The narrator is not Guy de Maupassant. He's just the writer. So we never want to confuse the writer with the narrator. Some people tend to do that. Some critics tend to do that. But we don't want to do that ever. We want to stick to the story, stay within the story. The story is complex enough to try to understand it, much less trying to understand the writer of the story. So we just accept the fact that Guy de Maupassant wrote it, and the third-person narrator is telling us the story. The first sentence from the third-person narrator is a powerful one, and it sets the tone for the entire story. Paris was under siege, starving, and at her last gasp. That's the first sentence. So a city under siege is when it is surrounded by opposing force that's attacking on all sides. And the goal of the siege is to force the city to surrender by cutting off supplies, reinforcements, and preventing troops from leaving, preventing anybody from leaving. So it's like you surround them, right? Some of the most famous, more famous ones of sieges was Troy by the Greeks, which has been made into many movies. The Siege of Troy by the Greeks. Helen of Troy. Brad Pitt movie, great movie. Leningrad was a prolonged military siege in the Second World War by Germany. Some Italians fought there too against the Russians. They sieged Leningrad. Very bloody battle. And there are many others, and you can imagine what being under siege is like. For example, the lockdown that we had in COVID, well, it was kind of a siege, wasn't it? We were locked down. We couldn't go anywhere. I mean, we could go out to get food, theoretically, right? But we were locked down. We were under siege. So the third-person narrator finishes this sentence by saying it's starving and at her last gasp. Who's her? Pronoun usage is very important. At her last gasp, he's treating Paris as a feminine word, and he says her last gasp. Okay? Not his last gasp. Could have, but it's a her. Why is Paris a her? Well, who cares, right? Doesn't really matter. It's the narrator who says it's her. Now, what does it mean to be starving and at your last gasp? Have you ever been hungry? I mean, really hungry, not, oh, I'm hungry for supper. It's time for supper. Paul Newman made a movie called Hombre. If you haven't seen it, I suggest you see it. And in there, he plays an Indian who is left a piece of property in a town, and he has to go into the town to sell the property. So he's actually lives on the Apache reservation, and he's actually part of the military police. So he goes to town, sells it, and he's on the coach going back. Now, he happens to be on the coach with the Indian agent and his wife, who have been for several years stealing money from the government and padding their pockets instead of helping the Indians. So, and there was a couple of other people on the coach, including a great character actor, Richard Boone, who plays the evil bad guy. In any case, they're on the coach, and Mrs. Indian Agent is describing the stunning appearance of the Indians as they walk around almost naked around the reservation. And Paul Newman, of course, who's already been established as a very tough hombre, is sitting there just listening quietly. He plays a very quiet, tough guy, very quiet. So she's talking about them and how stunning they are. And then she says, but they eat dogs. And Paul Newman looks at her and then, and then basically says under his breath, or basically he says, you ever been hungry? And she goes, what? He says, have you ever been hungry? And she looks at him and she says, I don't care how hungry I was, I would never eat a dog. And he looks at her and just says very calmly, he says, you'd eat the dog and you'd fight for his bones. And then he goes back to basically looking outside the coach window. I've never been that hungry where I would eat a dog, but I'm sure if I were starving and at my last gasp, I would definitely look for something to eat. You understand? That's what we're talking about here in a siege, is extreme hunger. The second sentence talks, try to do that, fast for a few days. Try not to eat for 3 days, see what happens. The second sentence talks about the effects of the siege. This is very important. Listen to the language. The sparrows were disappearing from the roofs, and the city's sewers were being depopulated. Isn't that beautiful right here? People were eating anything they could find. So in the first 3 sentences, he's just painting a picture of hunger, genuine hunger. Now, the narrator could have said the rats were leaving, because that's what he means here, that the city sewers were being, who lives in a sewer? Right? Rats, right? You've seen some pictures of the enormous rats in Chicago or New York. Now, the narrator could have said that the rats were leaving, but instead, he used different language to express this thought. Now, why is that? Why did the third person narrator choose to say this way? Well, the writer, Maupassant, has a third person narrator painting with language. That's what you have to understand here. There are 100 ways to say this. Well, maybe 50 ways to say that the rats were leaving because the city, there's no food. The rats were leaving because there's no food. But now this is Roger Colette translating this from the French, Guy de Maupassant, who narrator says the city's sewers were being depopulated. That's a beautiful way, isn't it? Part of what makes stories like this a classic is, in fact, the language. So remember, literature is language charged with meaning, as Ezra Pound said, charged with meaning. The city's sewers were being depopulated. The rats were leaving the city. If you say that, it could mean the people are leaving the city. Sorry, because some of them might be rats, right? Rat. People were eating anything confined. Again, remember the hombre story. Remember, you're hungry. You're really, really, really hungry. He's setting the tone. And the second paragraph introduces the two friends. That's the title of this story. One bright morning, January, Mr. Morissot, a watchmaker, idler by necessity. Why isn't he an idler by necessity? Because there's a war going on and nobody needs watches. They need food, not watches. He's walking sadly. He's not just walking, he's sadly walking along the boulevard with an empty stomach. And we know why it's empty, right? Siege. His hands in his pocket of his uniform trousers. Uniform trousers, they're at war. When he came face to face with a comrade in arms whom he recognized as an old friend, Mr. Sauvage, a riverside acquaintance. Now, you see, when we were reading, there's this red line here. There's this line. That's Jimmy breaking it up because now we're in for a flashback. Flashback is an important term. So he's walking sadly. His hands are in his pockets. He meets his comrade. And then this flashback. What's a flashback? It's where you stop. And you see this sometimes in series you're watching on Netflix or other streaming or a television program. You'll be watching it. It starts and then suddenly you see 2 months ago or a year ago or 24 hours ago. Suddenly, that thing flashes on the screen. And when we watch series like that on television, my wife hates that. And I hate that. What do you mean? Well, they got to give what you're looking at context. They have to give it context. They have to put it in perspective. And that's usually what happens in a flashback. That's what this is. So look at the first sentence here. Every Sunday before the war. So you're in a war, and now it's before the war. You see how beautiful that transition is? And for the next several paragraphs, the narrator paints an idyllic scene of the two friends who go fishing every Sunday. Every Sunday, they go fishing. Every Sunday. And after that beautiful idyllic scene, they go back to reality. They know, and so once they recognize each other, they shook hands warmly. Warmly. They don't just shake hands. They shake hands warmly. Notice he doesn't say they loved, they hugged, they kissed. He doesn't say, they shook hands warmly. Warmly. They were struck by the changed circumstances in which they had met. So there's a war going on. They're under siege. There's no food. And before the war, they would go fishing every Sunday and catch fish. Sauvage sighed and said, "What a mess." Morissot said gloomily, "Oh, what weather we're having. This is the first fine day we had this year." So they've been sucking at the weather. It sucks. Everything sucks. There's a war going on. But today, the sky was a bright, unclouded blue. They walked on together side by side. This is very important. Language is very important, charged with meaning. And before the end of this story, those 3 words, side by side. Isn't there a song like that? Side by side. I forgot. Jimmy's going to find that song and sing it to you. No, don't worry. Don't take me seriously. But there is a movie. There is a song, Side by Side. Look it up on Google. I'm going to look it up on Google as soon as we're done with this analysis. So, but he's going to use this 5 times in the story. He uses it 5 times in the story. So he goes, "Remember our fishing? Those were the days. I wonder when we'll go again," said Sauvage. So they stop at the cafe for a pop, little abstinence together, little liquor, right? So the repetition helps charge these two words side by meaning, because don't forget the way they die. They die side by side. You see how beautiful this is? This is beautifully written. So I want to stop there and examine this from Aristotle, my buddy Aristotle's point of view. Very important to understand classic literature with an Aristotle umbrella overlay, right? So plot and Aristotle. According to Aristotle, there's a footnote here, number 1. You can read this. It's been in most of my analysis when I analyze stories. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher, and he wrote the Poetics, and in the Poetics, he examined tragedy, comedy. He classified it, and he's got excellent definitions, which you need to understand anything. You need to define your terms, which is what we're going to do today when we talk about the main themes in this story. The main themes being war, friendship, freedom. So Aristotle, rediscovering Aristotle is very, very, very important to understanding classical literature. So according to him, tragedy, number 2, tragedy is an imitation of an action, serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude. See that down here? Though through pity and fear affecting the proper purgation, catharsis of these emotions. When you read The Two Friends, you should have catharsis, pity and fear. And then you're purged of those things through catharsis. It's not what we define tragedy today. It's a story, but this is really what you're purged. You have feelings. When you read classical literature, you feel catharsis. There's not one story, book, novel, play that we read on Jimmy's website where you don't feel catharsis. And if you don't feel catharsis, go back and reread it with Jimmy. Go back and reread it with Jimmy. Because this classical literature is designed to help you feel things. Well, Jimmy, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Well, go back and slowly read what we read together. Because this story, these 2,200 words, if they don't move you to catharsis, through pity and fear, then something's wrong, and it's not me. So he defines tragedy as it has 6 main elements: plot, character, diction, thought, spectacle, and song, of which the first 2 are primary, which means plot and character, and that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to call your attention to thought as well, because that's the theme, and we will talk about the themes. So, plot is the most important, and what is plot? It's the representation of human action. It's the people moving. Any movie has plot. Any story has plot. Some are better than others. Some you say, where the hell did that come from? Because the plot is not logical. So plots, according to Aristotle, could be simple or complex. He clearly indicates complex are better. Number 3, footnote. I put a footnote here because sometimes Jimmy discusses the types of sentences we use: simple, compound, complex, compound, complex. And the more complex you get, the more beauty that the language can have. Although simple sentences can be good too. So if we go back for a moment, Paris was under siege, starving, and at her last gasp. What kind of sentence is that? Yes, it's a simple sentence. Paris was under siege, starving, last gasp. Subject was under siege, was starving, was at her last gasp. So was, verb, with these other transitive, right? Boom, boom, boom. Simple sentences. The sparrows were disappearing from the roofs, and the city sewers were being depopulated. That's a compound sentence. Why? Because you have a comma and a connector and a main clause, subject and a verb, and a main clause here. Sparrows were disappearing. City sewers were being depopulated. Were, past, right? Past tense. People were eating anything they could find. Simple sentence. You see, he's mixing simple, compound, complex, sentences, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, here we go. Two friends is a complex plot, and the actions of the friends drive the plot forward. We're going to find out why it's complex shortly. So the plot, according to Aristotle, must also be unified, has a beginning, a middle, and an end. In other words, it doesn't leave you hanging. Right? It has a beginning and a middle and an end, like a good essay, like a good speech, a beginning, a middle, and an end. And why is that? Why is that good? Well, because your life has a beginning, a middle, and an end, doesn't it? It's a structure. Planets, right? Stars have beginning, middle, and end. Things in life, trees, beginning, middle, and end. And the plot here must be sufficient length, but not long enough so you lose interest. The two friends meets this criteria because it takes place in a single day. It has a beginning where they meet on the street under siege, a middle where they decide to go fishing, and an end where they die. But what is the plot? Let's look at this two friends plot a little closer. So they meet while there's a war going on. We've established that, and they decide to go fishing, which is behind enemy lines, and they're captured and executed. The course of action start with their decision to go fishing. Now, I want you to keep in mind their political argument later on when they are fishing, in fact. They have this political disagreement, which we're going to cover in a moment, and they make a conclusion. Do you remember the conclusion? The conclusion was that men can never be free. Okay? Think about, I want you to keep that in mind. It's one of the main themes in here, if not the main theme, is freedom. These two guys, Morissot and Sauvage, conclude men can never be free. Well, right there, I got to challenge that because they decide to go fishing. I would say that that's their choice. They know there's a war going on. They know it's pretty goofy, especially since their place where they use the fish is behind enemy lines, right? And they're not that brave. They're just simple guys, quiet guys, regular guys, right? They're not warriors, right? Like Hector or Ulysses and Troy. Suppose we meet some of them, stammered Morissot. What would we do? And with mocking Parisian humor, which had survived in spite of everything, in spite of the siege, Parisian humor, Sauvage replied, we'd offer them some fish to fry. This is called irony. This is called irony. What's irony? Well, if you read the story with Jimmy, you know that's exactly what happens. Only they don't offer it. The commander takes it after he kills them. He takes the fish. That's the commander does that. So irony is a literary technique originally used in Greek tragedy by which the full significance of a character's words or actions are clear to us, although unknown to the character. Now, they don't know when he says this, they don't know they're going to be captured, shot, right, and thrown to the fishes. He sleeps with the fishes, right? But we do if we read the story and go back and doing what we're doing now, which is really understanding it in order to gain appreciation, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, we want, the way you appreciate is you go back. You read the story and you do what I'm doing now with you. You go back and you reread the story and you think about it. And therefore, whenever you're going to read this story again, if you do, you're going to have a much, much deeper appreciation for the words than you did the first time you read it. And ladies and gentlemen, that's true of classic. All classic literature shares that quality. Crappy literature does not have that quality. You can take a crappy novel and reread it 10 times, and you would not get any more out of it the 10th time than you did the first time. And there's plenty of those things hanging around. Plenty of them. I stopped and looked at some children's book the other day at the Hobby Lobby, and I am stunned at the crap that they offer. Stunned. Anyway, that's not why we're here. Third-person narrator describes their journey to the fishing area in great detail. And as they do that, after they get their pass, the mountain opening up with the big guns, they have a political discussion, which is one of the central themes of the story, that men would never be free. And all the while, the guns from the Mount Valérien are thundering, destroying French houses. This is very important. Crushing bodies. Think about the words that the narrator is using here. Pulverizing human lives. Crushing bodies. Putting an end to countless dreams, countless expectation, countless hopes of happiness, countless. 3 times they use the same word. And inflicting wounds that would never heal the hearts of girls, wives, and mothers in other lands. In other words, war is not a bigot. War doesn't give a shit who you are. Pardon me. Doesn't care. You know, a cannonball flying from that mountain coming onto the ground on a village, a French village, doesn't care who you are, how holy you are, how bad you are, doesn't care. War, it just doesn't care. All you got to do is look around you today at some of the conflicts going on and read this paragraph, and you'll see the beauty and the truthfulness of that beauty in the language that he expresses. Okay, third person is, now remember here too, the narrator describes these men. These are peaceful men of limited intelligence. What does that mean? Well, they're not Einsteins, right? But these limited intelligence men agree on this point, that men will never be free. Do you agree with that? This is a very good question. Do you agree with their conclusion? Remember, we read literature to see how others lead their life and how to lead our own. And if you do, if you, like them, you agree that you and I will never be free, we feel trapped. If we're not free, we're trapped. We're going to talk about freedom in a minute. Is that because that they are under siege that they feel like that they'll never be free? Aren't we all under siege in a sense? I'm taking a sip of coffee. In any case, as they talk and fish, the guns, thunder, etc., this is a description of war, and so the plot moves forward, and they're brought in front of the commander who gives them an ultimatum. And the ultimatum is basically, give me the password, and I'll spare your lives. If you don't, I'm going to execute you because for all I know, you're spying on me. That's what this sentence says. And then he goes, the 2 friends were standing side by side, ashen-faced. What does that mean? Ashen-faced, white. Scared, they're scared. Their hands were trembling slightly, but they said nothing. The officer goes on, nobody will be the wiser. You'll go back as if nothing happened, and the secret will go with you. If you refuse, you die. You die on the spot. So choose. So he's being very very matter-of-factly, right? Give me that password, and I'll let you go. Nobody will be the wiser. No one will be the wiser. No one will know. Your secret, right? The secret. No one will know. Except they'll know, right? They will know. So that's another great word we should examine. What is a secret? Do you have any secrets? Have you shared any secrets? And have those secrets become outside the person you shared it with? What is a secret? I forgot to analyze that. Let's talk about that later. So anyway, They remain motionless. So he gives 5 minutes from now, you're going to be at the bottom. He's calmly, he's very calm. You're going to be at the bottom of the river. 5 minutes. You've got relatives, I presume. And the cannon is still firing. Remember, in the backdrop of this dialogue here, or this monologue by the commander, because they're not talking, the guns are going off. Boom, right? So the two anglers stood there silent. The German gave an order. Then he moved his chair so as not to be too close. 12 men take up 20 paces with their rifles on the order. I'm going to give you a minute, said the officer, but not a second more. Then he takes them aside and tries to say, come on, tell me. No one will know. No one will know. He does it to both of them. They found themselves together side by side. There it is again. The officer gives the order. The soldier raised the rifle. Just then, Morissot's eye fell on the net bag full of fish lying on the grass. The pile of fish, which were still wriggling, right? Glistened in a ray of sunshine. Remember, it was a beautiful day. He felt a momentary weakness, and try as he might to hold them back, tears came into his eyes. Goodbye, Monsieur Sauvage, Morissot said. Goodbye, Monsieur, Morissot said his friend. They shook hands, trembling uncontrollably from head to foot. Fire! Shouted the officer, and 12 shots rang out together. Monsieur Sauvage fell forward like a log. Morissot, being taller, swayed, spun around, and fell across his friend's body. He lay there with his face to the sky, while blood gushed out of the holes in the front of his tunic. This, ladies and gentlemen, this is powerful writing. Pity and fear, powerful writing. This is a dramatic death scene, juxtapositioning of the friends with the indifference of the command. The commander is indifferent. He's just, give me the information or I'm going to kill you. But these people are trembling head to foot. They're going to die, and they do die. That's a sharp, casual indifference ending, right? He sees the fish, fry them up, Wilhelm. They'll be delicious. And then he lights his pipe. It's like nothing happened. 2 men are dead. So what do you make of it? Did any of you cry at this when we read it together? Or did you, like the commander, just feel, so what? 2 more guys dead. Well, regardless if you felt emotional or you didn't feel anything, it certainly meets Aristotle's definition of a plot. And the question you're going to have to ask yourself is, what would you do if you were in their position? And as you can see, the themes of the story are war, loyalty, friendship, and most of all, freedom. One more word on plot. Aristotle is always concerned to establish categories because he's an analyst, he's a scientist, and he wants to distinguish between simple and complex plots. There's a difference. Simple plot represents a change of fortune, which they have, but it doesn't come about through the reversal of the situation and does not involve recognition on the part of the hero. In the complex plot, the change of fortune emerges of necessity from the events preceding it. So it didn't just happen that these guys were shot. All the events led up to their getting shot. They crossed enemy lines. They got caught, right? They won't cooperate with the commander's wishes, so they die. And it's brought through a reversal of the situation. They thought they'd get home free and eat those fish because they were starving, but they didn't. They got caught. So I think we can conclude Two Friends is a complex plot. And if you're wondering the difference between comedy and tragedy, Aristotle says comedy treats of less virtuous people focused on weaknesses and foibles. Aristotle cautions his readers to understand characters in comedy as more ridiculous. And you could read a comedy on Jimmy's website called Lysistrata, by Aristophanes, which is a really funny comedy. It's not a tragedy, but it's very funny. It's very funny. Anyway, character. Aristotle said that character is the second most important component of plot. He argued characters should be believable. So the first question you have to ask yourself, did you believe these characters, that they were like you and I, right? I don't have anything in here to say that they're not like you and I. There's hunger, they're hungry, they go fishing, they enjoy the beautiful scenery, they get caught, they shake in their booties, right? After they get caught and they're in front of a firing squad. There's a cocky commander who doesn't give a care about them. He's just, quote unquote, being his commander, right? Right? Aristotle also believed tragedies had a balance between good and evil characters. Two Friends has that balance, doesn't it? The war makes it more difficult to decide who is evil, because some of you are saying, well, the Prussian just was following his orders. Was he? We're going to talk about that, freedom of choice. Character and virtue. Aristotle said that moral character is determined by the structure of the acts and how they fit together. Well, that's true. In this story, the two friends, as well as the commander, act according to their moral characters. They're at war with each other. They're fighting each other. War has its own set of rules, kill or be killed. The focal point is, in fact, the password. The two friends won't give it up, so they die. It's important to note that Aristotle also believed virtue existed on a spectrum between deficiency and excess. Too much, too little. Aristotle called this the golden mean. So take a important thing like virtue. Take a virtue like truth. Truth is on a spectrum. You can have an excess amount of it, or it be deficient in the truth. How can you have too much truth, Jimmy? Well, can you handle the truth? Can any of us handle the truth? You get a diagnosis from the doctor, and it doesn't sound good. Can you handle that? Or is that just too much to handle? Maybe you don't want to know about it, right? Maybe I shouldn't tell you the truth. There's a deficiency of truth. Anything you think about has an excess and a deficiency. It's too much or too little. That you got to be right. You got to have a balance. That's what Aristotle always tried to teach. Because your strength could become a weakness. And that's true in life. I want you to think about these things. Aristotle also believed characters can't act without reference to the situation in which they're placed. He also believed passive characters have no place in drama. They're there just to be there. So characters in this story seem to always act with reference to the situation that they're in. They go fishing because they're hungry, right? Their normal situation is completely different because the war is raging around them. And the Prussian commander isn't out of his character when he orders their deaths. That's what he does. Now, some of you are going to speculate, did he have to do that? Did he have to really do that, kill these two people? Well, some say yes, some say no, right? That's what makes life interesting and understanding this short story, right? Anyway, thought. So Aristotle's concept of thought refers to the underlying idea or message conveyed by the actions and plot of this play. So it's the theme of the two friends, the theme. What's the inner meaning that we're supposed to contemplate and understand from the tragic heroes' downfall, from their deaths and the events around their deaths? What are we supposed to walk away with? In the two friends, right, they decide that men will never be free. That's their decision when they're arguing. And they end up dying, proving the exact opposite, that in fact they are free. They choose not to give up the password or the pass. They choose that. They choose that. They didn't have to. They could have gave it to the commander, but they didn't. So how can men never be free when in fact they demonstrate perhaps the highest form of freedom, giving up their lives for, there's a war going on, giving up their lives. They clearly make this choice. So are we free or not? Here's your question. And while you debate that in your head, I'm going to examine freedom for you. Okay? Take a pause, take a breath. Are you free? Oh, I've heard of situations where if you tell me I'm not free, I'm going to beat the crap out of you to show you I am free. Let's not get violent. Let's not get silly. What is freedom? One of the best books you'll ever read, if Jimmy doesn't read it with you on this website, is Arthur Schopenhauer's essay on the freedom of the will. Have you read it? Have some of you read it? According to Schopenhauer, who was a 19th century philosopher, and he dealt with the idea that the universe is not a rational place. It's not rational. Well, that's to be debated. But he was inspired by Plato and Kant, who's tough, very tough philosopher to read, and developed their philosophies emphasizing that in the face of a world filled with strife, we ought to minimize our natural desires for the sake of achieving a more tranquil frame of mind and a disposition toward universal beneficence. Good. Let me change that. Universal good. Whatever that means. That's according to Stanford University, right? That's what they say that this guy Schopenhauer talked about. But you got to read the book for yourself. In any case, I did. And Schopenhauer was, in my opinion, a remarkable thinker. And his book brings home what freedom really means. And in this case, he traces it back to the freedom of your will. You know what a will? I have the willpower. Willpower. It's in me. Will. I don't know what it is. I never saw it, but we all have willpower, don't we? Jimmy studied Schopenhauer when he minored in philosophy and theology in college, a long time ago, but he's continued his study and he continually refers to his notes from those years. First, like Aristotle says, pardon me, we want to deal with this word. We got to define freedom. What is freedom? Well, you can't see it, touch it, hear it, right? You can't. It's one of those intangible concept words, right? Like truth, beauty, love. These are words that we use, but yeah, we never really know what they mean. I love you. What is love? Oh, I love hamburgers. What is freedom? Well, Schopenhauer, when you look carefully at this concept, it's a concept. He says it's a concept. It's an idea. It is. And if I say the word to you, freedom, you're all thinking in your own mind what it means. And I want you to do that. Think about what it means to you. What does freedom mean to you? Does it mean getting home when you want to get home, regardless of your curfew? Does it mean, what is freedom? I can disobey my parents. What is freedom? What is freedom? I could choose not to study tonight. I'm free to do that. Or I can choose to study. I'm free to do that. Well, according to Schopenhauer, it turns out freedom is a negative. What does that mean? Well, it signifies the absence of any hindrance and restraint. Isn't that a beautiful definition? Freedom means no hindrance, no restraint, right? The absence, that's what he means by negative. There is no hindrance, there is no restraint. That's what freedom is, isn't it? I remember arguing with one of my writers when she first started working for me about freedom, right? So, well, we were talking about it. We got into basically an argument, a good discussion. And she said she was free to do anything she wants. I said, well, it's true, but you need money. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, without money, you can't be free. I like to poke the bear, as they say. I like to cause a little disruption. You should think about that too, all right? Is money freedom? Well, I would respectfully tell you, the more money you have, the more free you are. If you don't have money, you ain't free. You're less free than a guy with money. I'm just telling you. And that's a Maslow hierarchy of need discussion. We can go into that sometimes. But the absence of hindrance and restraint. So she basically said, well, I can always go on a picnic. I don't need money to go on a picnic. And I said, where are you going to get the food? You see? Schopenhauer says freedom is no hindrance, no restraint. Okay, I think we can agree with Schopenhauer. Do you believe that? I do. So Schopenhauer goes on to classify freedom into 3 types of freedoms, and this is really very important. And I have always found this extremely useful when discussing freedom, as in this case with the 2 friends, because if their conclusion that men will never be free is correct, if that's true, we will never be free, then that means we always have a hindrance or restraint on us. Is that right? Can you understand that? So if that's true, that we will never be free, then you and I will always be hindered and restrained. So what the hell are we talking about when we're fighting for freedom? You remember Braveheart? Freedom! Remember when he screams? Freedom! And then they have that war with the English, and he beats the crap out of them. He's all bloody at the end, right? Freedom! No one's going to tell us what to do. Right? Freedom. These two men of limited intelligence believe men will never be free. Well, let's find out, shall we? Let's look at Schopenhauer's 3 types of freedom. All right? First type, physical freedom. Schopenhauer says, this is not subject to doubt, as reality is always authenticated empirically. In other words, you can see physical freedom, right? You can move. I can move my arms. I can move my legs. Someone in a wheelchair can't, perhaps. So they're less physically free than I am. But if I can move all my body parts and I'm not in prison, a prisoner is less free than me, obviously, right? But if I can move all of my body parts, I've got to be, there's nothing restraining me. Well, can you jump 20 feet? Can you go without sleep? Can you go without using the toilet? I would say physically, you could say we're probably more free than a person in prison, but both the prisoner and ourselves, we're restrained. Would you agree with me that physically we are not free? Because there are hindrances and there are restraints on us. Our bodies get corrupted over the years, right? We're born, we live, we die. We're subject to disease. Remember COVID? I had COVID before it had a name. Was in New York on a business trip. I came back and I didn't know what the hell happened to me. It was unbelievable. Unbelievable. And I was at that age where they say that should have killed me, but it didn't. Here I am reading. In any case, you're not physically free. Okay. Can we agree on that? So physical freedom we're hindered and restrained. The second category he has is intellectual freedom. What's that? Well, that's what you think about. You think about things. Oh, Jimmy, there we go. Jimmy, I can think about anything I want. I have total freedom. There are no restraints, right? There's no hindrances. I can think about anything I want. You can't stop me, right? Well, you can only think about what you know. You can't think. If you never read Schopenhauer, you can't think about Schopenhauer. You understand? If you've never been to Greece, you can't think about Greece. I mean, you can read about Greece and then think about Greece, but you cannot think about everything. You can't do it. No one can. You can only think about what you know. Right? If you just started reading Jimmy and you haven't read any of his classics, you cannot think about them. If you haven't read The House of Usher, you can't think about it. Well, I heard about it. I saw the movie. Well, good. You're there, but you can't think about the way Edgar Allan Poe used language, can you? You can't do it. It's impossible. Fixing a car, mechanically, I am a putz. Jimmy's a putz. You could show me and especially nowadays with all this electronic stuff, you lift up the hood of the car, and I don't know what I'm looking at. Wouldn't know where to begin. The fact is, you and I don't know everything, so we can only think about what we know or what we can imagine. Now, we can imagine, we can make stuff up, we can create in our heads, but we're restrained and hindered. Even intellectually, we can only think about what we know. Would you understand that? Can you understand that? Well, I have an unlimited imagination. Well, of course you do. But you can't think about everything because you can only think about what you know. Well, the third category is moral freedom. What the hell is that? Well, morality is a system of ideas that helps us determine right from wrong, good from evil. Would you agree with that? That's the definition of morality. It's a set of standards and principles that come from culture, religion, philosophy, or a universal standard. Morality is not the same in cultures. It's different. And it changes, right? It changes sometimes before your eyes. But in any case, it's a system. It's standards. It's things you believe. You believe this is right, and you believe this is wrong. Whether or not some people don't believe in right and wrong. They don't believe there is such a thing as good and evil, right? Well, is that true? Can you be neutral? So in other words, you don't believe anything is right and wrong and everything is permissible, right? Well, that's a Dostoevsky thought, which we can talk about when and if we ever read those beautiful novels of Fyodor Dostoevsky, right? But if you believe everything is permitted, everything, well, you better think twice, because then there is no morality, right? There is no morality. None. Maybe that's true freedom, isn't it? But it's not. Moral freedom means the ability. You have set up a system you've created, and there is no hindrance or restraint on you in choosing this or that. In a morality system, right? Regardless of the system, whatever system it is you're in, you have the freedom to choose this from that. We are truly experiencing on the moral plane the absence of hindrance and restraints. In other words, those two friends, they decided men will never be free. Well, physically they won't be, intellectually they won't be, but morally they are, they will be. And the two friends demonstrated that through their actions because they chose not to give up the pass, right? They chose not to do that. If everything was permitted, why not give it to the commander and continue to live? So they must have had some belief, some system, something that drove them to stay silent. Do you understand? So there's always two choices. There's always yes or no, go, stop. You do things or you don't. You make choices. Your life is filled with choices. You are absolutely free. You can't be physically free. You can't be intellectually free. But morally, you can be free. You can be free. You can choose things. Now, choices have consequences, as evidenced by the two friends, right? They made a choice and they died for their choice. They died because of their choice. Well, Jimmy, What if they gave up the password or the passes to the commander? He would have shot him anyway. How do you know that? You don't know that. You don't know that. That's speculation. I'm going to touch on that in a minute. When you're a kid, your parents make you behave. You have a fight at school, you're told fighting isn't good. The other people tell you, oh no, fighting is good. You see, choices are all around us. All around us. Don't read this, read that. Don't read that, read this. Right? Don't watch that, watch this. Don't play sports. Nah, play this sport. Don't play that sport. Play video games. The question is always, how free are you when it comes to making your choices? According to the two friends, you're never free, but their actions speak louder. They are free to keep silent, and they do. I've always argued that the more you know, the more choices you have, and the more free you are. Can you argue against me? Send me an email, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. The more you know, the more choices you have. Or, as Teilhard de Chardin said, the more you know, the more you look, the more you know. The more you know, the better you know where to look. The more you know, the more you look, the more you know. The more you know, the better you know where to look. Don't forget that. Don't forget that. That's true. So, Morissot and Sauvage had a choice. They can give him or not. They chose not to, and they died. So some of you are saying they may have been killed anyway. Speculation is always interesting, but we when we're reading a story like this, classical literature, we can speculate all we want on our own. But the beauty about classical literature is that we have the evidence in front of us. Like a real life event that happens in real life, unless you're there, you have to believe it, or if you see it on the news or something like that, maybe you don't believe your eyes. Maybe you do believe your eyes. I don't know. It's hard to say, especially with artificial intelligence these days, right? I had a client tell me 2023 last year, it was the last year you'll be able to believe your eyes. That in fact, everything from 2023, you don't know if it's real or not. They used to have a commercial about Memorex, VHS tape. Is it live or is it Memorex? When they would replay the tape, is it live or is it a recording? It's very difficult to be alive today, isn't it? You don't know what you believe, or do you? You're free to believe anything you want, right? Well, you can only believe what you know. So learn. Read, think. Learn, read, and think. Keep thinking. And speculate all you want, but here in this beautiful story, we know what happened. We can go back 10 times and read this, and it won't change. Maybe our interpretation will change, but the words won't change. Unless you read a different translation. But the words of this translation, what Maupassant through the third person narrator is telling us, won't change. There's the evidence. The evidence. So these two guys, Morissot and Sauvage, could conclude that men are not free, but I don't believe them because they proved it through their actions that they are in fact free. They're free. They were free on the moral plane. They chose not to give the password up. Right? So they had free will. They will, your free will. We all have a free will, don't we? So Schopenhauer gets into a whole analysis of the freedom of the will. That's the title of his essay, right? But I'm not going to do that here, ladies. I will be here too long, right? But one of the things he said is that no one can know how another, or even how he himself, will act in a definite situation until he has been in it. Try not to forget that. You don't know if you were in the two friends or the commander's position. You don't know what you would do. You don't. And you don't know how another person might act, except in this piece of classical literature. How do we know? Because the third person tells us what they did. And we have to believe them if the story's going to make sense. That's the beauty of classical literature. We can put ourselves in the friend's place, and we can do what-if scenarios on how we would act. Would you really die to save your country? Did they save their country? Do you know the outcome of the Franco-Prussian War? Well, Jimmy, that's not in the story. This is just a story about two people that got shot. It's true. But you can always Google what was the outcome of the Franco-Prussian War and see if these guys' deaths meant anything. I'm not going to tell you. You look it up. And there are many examples from history to draw from in terms of giving up your life for your country or not. What would you do? What would you do? What would you do? And you can see why the study of literature is so valuable. But before you answer these questions, I want to share another Schopenhauer observation. You can only do what you will, but in any given moment of your life, you can only will one definite thing, and absolutely nothing other than that one thing. What do you mean, Jimmy? I can will anything I want. Of course you can, but in any given moment, you can only will one thing. Try to pick up a pencil. Right? If you're going to pick up a pencil, will yourself to pick up the pencil, and also will yourself to pick up the mouse next to the pencil. See, you can only do one thing. One of my great friends that passed away was an art director, Clark. And Clark was just a genius, just a beautiful man, artist. He told me one day when we were talking at lunch, multitasking is a myth. And I said, what do you mean? He says, well, you can only do one thing at a time. And he was actually reflecting Schopenhauer, whom he had read. Clark was a very, very well-read guy, fought in World War II, was a warrior, an unbelievable artist, rode motorcycles in his spare time. And when he said that, you can only do multitasking is a myth. You can only do one thing at a time. That's exactly what Schopenhauer is saying here. And we often think about some people can multitask. No, you can only do one thing at a time. If you think about it, you can't do more than one thing at a time. You can string them together, but you can't do them all together. In any moment, you're only doing one thing, right? And it's that moment of decision that the two friends made, not to talk, that one thing, they side by side, right? What if one of them gave in? They didn't, side by side. It's a story of friendship, true friendship, really. They died together. They lived together. They died together. It's an extraordinary story, and these two guys were very lucky, in my opinion, to have found each other and just lived their life like this. And a tragic end. And the commander, the Prussian guy, well, he was just a Prussian, right? I don't think he had sympathy for the two friends. He was hungry too, because, he was the guy putting the city under siege. And he knew those fish would be delicious. Anyway, Clark introduced me to another good book. It's a marvelous book. I don't think we'll read it because it's not a classic yet. Gotta wait a few years. But anyway, it's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. If you get a chance, it is worth reading. You've been reading with Jimmy. We've been analyzing Two Friends, the short story by Guy de Maupassant. So be sure to visit and read other classics with Jimmy on this website. I'd like you to email me, Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, with any comments, conclusions, questions you have on this or other stories. Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Thank you for listening, spending some of your time with me, and hopefully you got something out of this beautiful story. Thanks so much. Have a great day.